It's great to see you back this evening. We've been studying about David and Bathsheba, that particular story, and a series of lessons on David generally over the past several weeks. And yes, this is the third lesson, and this is the last lesson on David and Bathsheba. But it is a big story in its scope as you consider the various things about that story. And let's face it, it's a story that kind of captures the mind, the imagination as you read the life of David. And as you consider, well, about the life of David, what's most often remembered? Well, probably the story of David and Bathsheba. Now, last week, we had, of course, gotten beyond the sin of David and Bathsheba and the cover-up, but then we were to the, as it were, uncovering, as Nathan confronts David. And you remember he tells him the story about this poor man who has one lamb, a ewe lamb. It's a female lamb, that it's like a child to him as he would cuddle it, as he would hand feed it, and as it was with his children. And then there was a rich man, many flocks and herds, and someone comes to town, and so the rich man, to feed this man coming to town, doesn't take of his many flocks and herds. He steals the one ewe lamb of the poor man, slaughters it, feeds it to the guest. Well, David, hearing this, is outraged. And in reading the story, you kind of wonder, is David thinking, is this possibly an actual event in his own kingdom of a rich man and a poor man? And David, outraged, he pronounces judgment saying this man should die and that he should repay fourfold. It's then that David is confronted. You are the man. It is as if David has been that rich man that took the very one from the poor man. Well, there was Uriah, just the one wife. David had several. And he not only took his wife, he even then took the life of Uriah. Yes, David is the man. So he's the one, according to his own words, that should die or should repay fourfold. One thing to be learned certainly from this is be sure your sin will find you out. One thing certainly to be learned from this is be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, so shall he also reap. He that soweth to the flesh, loveth the flesh, reap corruption. Something to be learned from this: neither is there any creature that is not manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and open unto him with whom we have to do. David couldn't hide his sin. It was found out. But wait, David die? Repay fourfold? Well, it is the case that he himself, is not going to die. But as you continue to read his life, it is as if he repays fourfold. The first repayment is found in 2 Samuel 12:14, where you read, because of this deed that thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child that is born unto thee shall surely die. Repay fourfold. It starts with his child. In 2 Samuel 12:15, you begin reading, then Nathan went to the house, and the Lord afflicted the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and he became sick. David therefore besought God on behalf of the child. And David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. And the elders of his house stood beside him to raise him from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. And on the seventh day, the child died. Nothing will grip your heart quite like a child sick unto death. And it not only grips just friends, maybe even strangers. What it does to that parent. And here David is. Not only is this his child sick and then eventually dies, but let's just face it. It can't help but run through his mind, his heart. He's sick because of me. He's dying because of me. Because of this deed, because of his sin with David and Bathsheba, because of his killing Uriah, the child that is born unto thee shall surely die. So David's not only dealing with a sick child and a child that's going to die, and then a child that dies. He's got to run it through his mind, through his heart, over and over again. That sin with Bathsheba, killing Uriah, and because of this, I'm being punished, but it had consequences for my child. Now somebody might raise their hand and say, wait a minute. The child, it's innocent. The child did no wrong. Why is the child dying? Every single day, I think you could even say every hour of the day, there are children suffering the consequences of their parents' sins. Maybe it's that the parents, during that conception and gestation of that child, abused alcohol or drugs, and then that child is born. Fetal alcohol syndrome. Or literally with drugs flowing through its system. And maybe it's affected for the rest of his life if it lives. Or maybe even as the child may be born healthy, but maybe the mom or dad have chosen a life of sin. And as a result, maybe it's alcohol, maybe it's drugs, maybe it could be a number of things. But then the child doesn't have what it needs, whether it may be physically the food, drink necessary to proper growth, or maybe the love that ought to be given by a mom and a dad, or maybe even a result is incarceration of a parent. That child is robbed, as it were, of a parent. Every day, every hour of the day, some children suffer as a consequence of their parents' sin. The child is innocent, but the child is suffering. And so it is with this case. I think that when we kind of read the story of David and Bathsheba, the killing of Uriah, and then the subsequent life of David, it ought to make us almost shake in our boots as to when we as adults, leaders of a family, sin. What could be the consequences that are brought in our families because of our own sin? First, repay fourfold. First, this child of David and Bathsheba dies. Number two, you get to 2 Samuel chapter 13. And you read of Ammon, who fell in love with Tamar. Now, they would have been if you would, half-brother, half-sister. And Amnon wants Tamar, but not quite sure how to proceed about it. Well, I think you remember the story that kind of a plan was worked out, but the plan ended in disaster as he rapes his half-sister. And then you read about that Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And he puts the woman out, his half-sister, even bolts the door after her. He rapes her, he abandons her. And at this particular juncture, we might say, well, wait, not a death. But can you imagine the disruption of a household when such a deed would take place? And so it was that, you might say, such a disruption of David's household took place because of this terrible thing. And so, in other words, we read about the sin, we read about the confrontation from Nathan, and then immediately we start reading about these horrible things happening in the life of David and his family. And it's as if he's repaying fourfold. That first child that was born of David and Bathsheba dead. And then we find that Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. And now we might say number 3, because you don't have to go very long, but what now you read about Absalom and what he schemes to do. Absalom would have been, if you would, the whole brother of Tamar. And it's very apparent that he cares about his sister. He's close to her, and he's enraged at what has been done to her. And so enraged that he's determined to exact vengeance. In 2 Samuel 13:20 you read, and her brother Absalom said to her, has Amnon your brother been with you? Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart. So Tamar lived, a desolate woman, in her brother Absalom's house. At this point we might think, okay, he's taking care of his sister. He's doing the right thing. But the reality is he's kind of biding his time. He's determined to get even, to get his revenge. And he does that. When you get to 2 Samuel 13, beginning of verse 23, it says, after 2 full years. So he waits 2 years. So you can just imagine. It's always buried in the back of his mind, his heart. Get even with Amnon. Get even with Amnon. Probably, I hate Amnon. Alternated between get even with Amnon. After 2 full years. So as Absalom had sheep shears at Baal-hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. And Absalom came to the king and said, behold, your servant has sheep shears. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. And the king said to Absalom, no, my son, let us not all go, lest we be burdensome to you. He pressed him, but he would not go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said to him, why should he go with you? But Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Push, 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 and he got his way. Not only Amnon, all the king's sons were there. Then Absalom commanded his servants. He says, mark when Amnon's heart is merry with wine. And when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. And while they were on the way, news came to David, Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. Of course, you know, this message was in error. Only Amnon was killed. Yet Amnon was killed. So now we've read of the child being killed. That's number one. We've read of the horrible deed of Amnon raping his half-sister Tamar. Then we are now reading about Absalom killing Amnon, waiting 2 years to do it, but apparently so determined to have his vengeance, to get that revenge. Well, then we find, once again, Absalom flees. Time passes. And then finally he's kind of allowed to come back, and then steals the heart of the people. Somebody might say, well, David kind of stole the heart of the people when he was one of the soldiers of Saul, but it wasn't the same, was it? David was innocent in heart. His motives were honest. Absalom was not. Absalom deliberately tried to effect a rebellion against his father. He led the people in rebellion against David with full intent to take over as king. Now, I don't know what you think about this story, but to me it's very gripping. The idea that David's own son would treat him in such a fashion. David eventually has to flee Jerusalem as if he is a fugitive, because Absalom's rebellion is so strong. Somebody might think, how could Absalom do that? Well, admittedly, there have been a lot of sad things that children have done to hurt their parents. There was a speaker many years ago. He would often speak to young people at youth rallies and such as that. And one of the things he liked to say, he said, young people, about the worst thing you can do is lie to your parents. And I'll admit, if somebody says, what's the worst thing somebody can do? I don't know that I would have put that atop the list. But I think he had several reasons for suggesting that. For one, they are the first authority figure that you know in your life. And if you can then bring yourself to lie and deceive that person, then what's that going to lead to with other authority figures in your life? If you're willing to betray that person who loves you more than anybody else living, what will that then lead to? His point, kind of the worst thing you can do, lie to your parents. Well, here we see Absalom betraying his father to the point of trying to steal the kingdom from him, and his father has to flee like a fugitive. Now, in the Old Testament, stoning was the punishment for such sins. So we can see that God looks upon rebellion against parents as a great disgrace, dishonor, and sin. You know, in 2 Samuel 12, verses 9 and 10, those words, the sword shall never depart from your house. And so, you know, we read about the child dying. Once again, Amnon raping Tamar, Absalom killing Amnon, and now this rebellion. But this rebellion, as horrible as it is, as sad as it is, You know what it led to. It was a civil war. In 2 Samuel chapter 18, beginning of verse 9, then Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak. And he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. Then in verse 14, Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand, thrust them in the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. 10 young men, Jacob's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. So now David has lost another son. And you know, it may be that someone might think, well, hold on a minute. This son's been rebellious. He's already killed one of his children. Now he's trying to take David's throne. He's made his dad flee like a fugitive. You know, I think David could probably deal with maybe losing Absalom. No. He told, don't kill him. Joab violated that. And then you remember 2 Samuel 18:33, and the king was deeply moved, went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. This is when he learns of Absalom's death. He went and he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. You know, if there's a passage that points out the love of a father for the child, I think this kind of goes up towards the top of the list. Because once again, this child had killed one of his other children. This child had rebelled against him. This child had tried to take his throne. This child had made him flee like a fugitive. And yet hearing that this son dies, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. You know, the word love isn't found in that verse, but it's found in every word there in that verse. It's dripping with love, isn't it? How much a parent loves their child. And even when, once again, that child has been of such a rebellious nature. You know, he said, David said to Nathan, the man should die. He should pay 4-fold. Now, you might examine it on the surface and say, well, if he dies, he can't repay 4-fold. But it was the case. God was going to allow David to live. But when you start reading again, subsequent to that sin, one horrible thing after another, after another, after another. And yes, you could say he repaid 4-fold. And this is where I'd want to say, us parents, us who in any capacity might be leaders, understand the nature of your influence and sometimes even the consequences of what we do affecting others. David. The story of David and Bathsheba would not be complete without the reading of Psalm 51. And we're going to read that entire chapter, Psalm 51, 19 verses. If you have your Bible, you might want to just turn there real quick. Psalm 51. Because this gives us insight into the heart of a man whose heart was like God, but a man who sinned and sinned grievously. And it wasn't just that it affected the lives of that child and some family members. It affected him dearly. Verse 1 says, to the choir master, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet went to him after he had gone to Bathsheba. Now the psalm, have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. You know, we too should realize He is a God who has a steadfast love and abundant mercy. And yes, He'll forgive, but it's as if David, in the depths of despair of the sin, begging God, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions. And then he says, my sin is ever before me. And when I read this, I think in terms of, it's as if he's committed that sin and he can't forget about it. It's as if he closes his eyelids and it's written across the back of his eyelids. If he awakes at night, that's what's on his mind. As he arises in the morning, that's what he remembers. And throughout the waking day, it's ever before him. Some things we just want to forget. We want to let go. My sin is ever before me. See, what we're seeing is the consequences of sin on a man's life and in his heart. That is a man who has the tender heart, the man whose heart's like God. Then he says, against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Now there was certainly the sense in which he sinned against Bathsheba, Uriah. There's a sense in which he sinned against his family and Israel by this sin. Well, let me just tell you, no matter how our sin affects others, it pales in comparison to it's a sin against God. Verse 5, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. And I know a lot of times people say, what exactly does this mean? And some people have mistakenly gone to Psalm 51 verse 5 and tried to say, well, this is hereditary total depravity, that he was born guilty of sin. And some translations, shall we just say this, do a worse job in translating this, almost as if a good Calvinist was on the translation committee and he wanted to kind of get his point in with Psalm 51:5. But if somebody says, well, what does it mean? Let me just mention this. One thing I think it could mean is he is so overwhelmed. He so feels the sin. Now listen, it's as if he's always been this way. No, he was born innocent. David lived a good, godly life. But now with this sin, can't remember the good anymore. It's as if all he's ever done was evil, sin. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being. You teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. It's like, give me a clean slate. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. I think what you could say and conclude is that as a result of this sin, he's lost his joy. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God. O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with the burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. And doesn't he evidence that in Psalm 51? Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. That concludes it. That's the end of David and Bathsheba. But what I want to see is he had to deal with it. He had to deal with his sin. He repaid fourfold. And he had to deal with God. And Psalm 51 is that dealing with God. You know, if somebody says, well, what do I learn from this? Do my best, my very best, my utmost best to stay away from sin. So they don't have to then bear the consequences, or those you love bear the consequences of those sins. For our own personal sin, there can be eternal guiltiness. We could be lost if we don't return to God. Others, no, they don't bear the guiltiness of the sin. But there can be consequences to be paid. If tonight you need to respond to God's invitation, if you wish to obey the Lord, we could assist you with that tonight. If there's a need for prayer, we'd be glad to take the time and pray for you. If you need to come, please